thought the music in the 70s was much more interesting than the music today.
The decline of the Roman Empire is what happened in the 70s, I think.
Hey, hang on, the 70s had a lot of good stuff. Every decade has good stuff.
There were a lot of good contributions that were made, and there was a lot of crap too.
There's an awful lot of sort of disco crap and other stuff, as there has always been.
But now, you know, I look back at the 70s and I find things that were really very good.
The great stuff from the Eagles,
ZZ Top,
Stevie Wonder, Fleetwood Mac,
Frank Zappa,
Sly and the Family Stone,
Little Feat,
Bob Marley,
Leonard Skinner, Roxy Music,
Rod Stewart,
Led Zeppelin,
Marvin Gaye,
Aerosmith,
Bob Seger,
Elton John.
I started in the 70s, for Christ's sakes.
What a healthy time it was for music, and there was this huge circle, 360 degrees of each degree being a different musical category. It's wonderful.
And there just got to be more music. You know, it used to be you had to be pretty big to make an album. But suddenly there were albums by people I'd never heard of.
I really believe that in the 70s, it was a great combination of fashion, artistic sense, songwriting. It was an incredible time.
Musically, it just seems like the 70s, everything was an excuse for a party.
We're just having a party.
It was okay to have a lot of money. It was okay to flaunt it.
Everybody had an airplane.
beautiful women anytime you wanted it.
Then came the cocaine, then came the booze, the
Jack Daniels,
cognac,
a six-pack.
Don't ever drink anything that you can't see through.
Nobody knew that everything was bad for you yet, or that could cause you to crash your car, or you're going to have to go to rehab for that one, you know, and on and on. It was a great time to be alive.
The 70s was the time when music blossomed. So many different styles and so many ideas. The artist had developed the ability to create an income to allow him some freedom. It was definitely a fun time. A lot of the bands that I was involved with, the Steely Dan, the Doobie Brothers, bands like that, used that time to experiment.
There were so many different aspects to music, what was being appreciated, what was actually being invested in by record companies.
In the 70s, the one good thing about it was I'd write like 10 new songs, go and record them, give them to a record company, and they go, oh, it's great. And then, you know, no politics or anything, and it would just be, and if you did well, which luckily they did, most of them, it'd be up in the charts, and there'd be no political kind of, well, we don't hear a single. You know what I mean? That sort of thing, that's which they do now a lot, to lots of people.
A band like Steely Dan probably we couldn't get arrested now. Because they said, well, what format are you in? Well, are you AC? Are you AOR? Are you CHR? Are you CHS? Are you FBI? You know, I don't know.
I'd like to introduce Led Zeppelin to you.
I think one of the most exciting things about the music of the 70s was it was a hybrid of what came before it, but it staked its own territory. What Cream was doing, what Zeppelin was doing, was taking blues and pumping it up on steroids and doing something that changed the nature of the beast.
I remember listening to the first Zeppelin albums, and it was like such a great breath of fresh air for someone to be doing something acceptable, but yet so different, you know.
Whatever it was pretty honest, a little devious, and certainly not adverse to a little bit of thievery, musically. However, you know, we're not the first people to have done that. Why don't you get home?
Now you consider everyone's all jolly and tiptoeing around, stoned on acid, having Woodstock and all love, peace and sex and drugs and rock and roll and all that's great, yeah. But for us guys that were living in this hole in the world, it wasn't that way. And Tony Iommi said to Hynde, wouldn't it be interesting to put this horror vibe to a musical thing? And then we started to write doomy music, we used to call it. Of this death music, this doom music. I'll never forget when I got the first Black Sabbath album and I took it home to my parents. It starts with rain and thunder and it's all this demonic devil stuff. And I can see my mother and my father look at each other and in amazement, and they both simultaneously turn around to me and says, Ozzy, are you sure you're just only drinking the occasional beer here?
Coming up, Fleetwood Mac reveals the story behind the making of their greatest hit.
You had two couples that were in the process of breaking up.
Later, Bruce Springsteen on the history of rock and roll. The history of rock and roll, brought to you by the
Chaos.
Loving you.
At the time that we were doing Rumors, there was this rather unusual situation within the workings of the band where you had two couples that were in the process of breaking up during the making of the album. So you had all this cross-dialogue going on. You had John McVie and Christine McVie breaking up. You had Stevie and myself breaking up.
Go Your Own Way was Lindsey talking to Stevie or not talking to Stevie. It was basically on your bike, girl. Whenever that song was at its peak, that was Stevie and Lindsey playing out whatever roles they were playing out. I mean, some heavy stuff went on with that song.
A lot of stuff came out of anger being in a rock and roll band. It's how do you do it? You don't punch your wife or get drunk or throw your Rolex. Write a song about it. I'll fix your ass.
Writing the blues, different people write different ways, but it's real easy to clutter up, especially when you're going for a blues type structure in the song. I mean, like if you want one cluttered up, send it to me. I'll be glad to.
There were a lot of bands back in the early 70s that did relate to our music a lot. Marshall Tucker, Charlie Daniels, Leonard Skinner. But nowadays it's not really fair to call the Allman Brothers a southern rock band anymore.
Rock and roll was pretty much born in the South. So was the blues, a certain kind of blues anyway. And saying southern rock is like saying rock.
Oh, I feel like I'm dying.
The rock and roll white boys had blues, which I never would have thought would be happening. So we had to find a new music, and to me the tempo of blues, right in the middle of rock and roll, the midway point is funky music. You know, it's not fast like rock and roll, and it's not all the way slow like the blues, but it's basically the same three chord changes.
Everybody funkin' and don't know how, so laughing at you.
We went back to like James Brown, the 2/4 thing, and just a basic groove. You couldn't define exactly what it was, so we called it Funkadelic. And we did it to a point till it was cartoonish, you know. So we exaggerated till it's animated, you know, and then with the costumes and a spaceship, you know, it knocks your head off. You walk around flinching to you.
In the 70s, George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelics and Earth, Wind & Fire, he was very serious about our music and who we were trying to touch. And I think that's one reason why the music of the 70s has not died, because it has a rejuvenating quality about it.
Get up, stand up, did you hear? Stand up for your right one more time.
Bob Marley made a great contribution in presenting us with reggae music and creating more of a universal acceptance of it. But I think Bob Marley's message was a universal message, so therefore it would touch everybody.
You get up, you stand up.
He was one of those Stevie Wonder types, true to the middle of the road. He didn't favor no sides of things. It was just people should be together no matter what.
What is your special message?
True peace and love and music, you know, and liberty.
Sick and tired.
He wanted everything at the same time and was everything at the same time. Prophet, soul rebel, Rasta man, herbs man, wild man, a natural mystic man, ladies man, island man, family man, Rita's man, soccer man, showman, shaman, human, Jamaican.
Experimentation becomes a driving force for Stevie Wonder, David Bowie, and Pink Floyd.
By the 1970s, artists continued to push the creative envelope, breaking free of old proven formulas and pursuing their own vision.
For Stevie Wonder, technology opened the door to new musical explorations.
The interesting thing about Stevie Wonder is he broke away from the Motown mold. He matured to the point where he said to Berry Gordy, I got to do what I do. I want to create my kind of music.
Stevie Wonder, going back to Talking Book, he was playing all the instruments himself and playing synthesizer. It was great.
And Stevie was recording like 150 to 200 songs during this period. And he did 4 of the greatest albums I think he ever did in his life, you know, Innovisions and all those great things. And he just fell in. And I remember there was these 2 synthesizer players, Bob Margoliouth and a friend of his, and they had this huge, monstrous array and depth of synthesizers. In old-fashioned days, you had to put in plugs, and they had cords like telephone operators had to plug in. And Stevie just did some of the most miraculous things, and then from there on in, you know, the synthesizer became another child that was a part of the vocabulary.
In the 70s, the artist had the opportunity to take the time in the studio to spend the time that he deemed necessary to really, really do his or her art, whether it was self-indulgent or not. I mean, Steely Dan used to take me 6 weeks just to find a comfortable chair at $300 an hour. You know, it was pretty silly.
The biggest problem with recording studios is the surfeit of options. There are far too many things.
Can I just hear the new Mellotron sound, please? That wasn't really quite exaggerated enough.
There's always an oscillation of attraction between going the whole hog with studio technology, which always goes over the top at some point. You know, the music of the early 70s was actually fairly tedious as a result of people suddenly becoming possessed by the idea that they were symphonic composers.
What do you know, and I found that was the most interesting aspect of the new music that we were doing at that time was actually working with synthesizers but throwing the manuals away so that we had no idea how the damn things worked. And it was the mistakes that they made that we found more interesting than the stuff that they were supposed, because these things are programmed by high-tech buffs who really don't have any sensibility of what can be done musically, so they put in the stuff that they believe musicians would want to use. And that's the stuff that you really don't want to hear because it's like fake strings and things like that. So if you get the wrong circuits going, you get all these crackles and farts coming out of these things. I mean, it just produces the most extraordinary sounds and different range of textures.
There is music that is sacred to us, and that's what's caused this attitude in the studio. You know, an album like Sgt. Pepper, well, everyone thinks they have a Sgt. Pepper in them somewhere, you know. But if there is a Sgt. Pepper of the 70s, you'd have to say that Dark Side of the Moon was it.
We were thinking in the 70s, as we do today, of making great records, which means an album to me. I mean, singles seem like part of a different business. We all believed in were aiming for the same thing, which is perfection, you know, every piece of music being magical and uplifting and wonderful, and the lyrics doing whatever particular job they were doing to that same extent. And so, you know, we were working towards a common goal.
We run back and drop in a bit?
Yeah, you can if you like. Just turn it down a bit.
Dark Side of the Moon was done at Abbey Road Studios. At some point during the proceedings, I don't remember exactly when it was, Roger came up with the idea of making it a piece about madness and all the other things that it's about. Roger was certainly a very good motivator and obviously a great lyricist. Roger was much more ruthless about musical ideas, where he'd be very happy to lose something if it was for the greater good of making the sense of the whole album work. So, you know, Roger would be happy to sort of make a lovely sounding piece of music disappear into sort of radio sound or something and sound really awful if it was benefiting the whole piece. For me, rock and roll just means that there aren't any rules, and it's just whatever you want to do, however you want to do it. People say it sounds so professional and so slick. I'd have to argue with that even today. I wouldn't say that my technique or some of the others' techniques were particularly in the brilliant era. It should be anything you want it to be, rock and roll. If it's moving any people in any way at all, then it's doing its job, I guess.
We hit it with everything.
Alice Cooper, Aerosmith, David Bowie, and Kiss take it over the top.
Right side of my face caught fire, the hair and everything.
On the history of rock and roll.
Each
became refined. I think the best of the 70s had the balance. You had groups who were able to make, in a recorded work, something different and special, but were really excellent at performing on stage. And certainly, if there was a criticism that people weren't putting as much raw energy in, I think you had to be there. I don't think it was really lacking if you were in Madison Square Garden or the Forum, at a Queen show or an Aerosmith show or a Zeppelin show, or I mean, it was, for me, it was very gut-wrenching.
You definitely get a buzz being up there. You can very much get caught up in what you're doing and trip all over everything. You got to keep one eye open and one eye shut. I always liked those people that kind of looked a little aloof and floating around, and for myself, I got to dance around monitors and speakers and wires, and enough of the arguments with the people to tape it down. If they can't, they don't, and better for me that I don't trip and fall over.
But you never know what to expect. I mean, the strangest of things happen in the middle of a show, you know.
I'm out there on a cherry picker, that huge long arm which reaches out over the audience. Oh, the times that thing took, it took like half an hour to get it back again. And one night it would just break down and it was just stuck out there. And I finished Space Oddity and I put the phone down. And I just didn't know what to do, because I'm just still stuck out there, and all the audience are down there, all these hands are coming up. And what do I do? Do I do the rest of the show out there? But that was the early days of rock theatre, I guess, and so many of those dreadful escapades.
We were supposed to breathe fire, and I really wanted to hit the ceiling. Of course, the ceiling was 40 feet up in the air, but in my mind, yeah, I could reach it. And so the fireball that came out of my mouth was too big. And on the very first show that we did on a big stage, right side of my face caught fire, the hair and everything. I later realized that if I didn't spray my hair with hairspray, it wouldn't catch fire, because the stuff says clearly, flammable. Gene Simmons, this means you.
Somebody threw a chicken on stage. This was in Toronto. And I'm from Detroit. I've never been on a farm in my life, And I said, a chicken, it's got wings, it'll fly. So I threw it back in the audience. I thought it was going to fly away, in the sunset. It went right into the audience, and the audience tore it to pieces. And threw the parts back up on stage. Now, the next thing I knew, it was Alice Cooper bites head off chicken and drinks the blood and tears the face, and all this stuff, And that's what the paper said the next day. And I got a call the next day from Frank Zappa, and he says, "Did you do that?" And I said, "No." He says, "Well, don't tell anybody that." He says, "They love it."
I think rock and roll for the longest time was boring, especially the American bands who were fat and ugly and didn't really care about their appearance. In fact, I remember going to see a lot of the San Francisco bands, and they literally turned their backs to you and play like that. I thought it was the biggest insult. I'm saying, what am I buying a ticket for? I could stay at home and put on the record. What are you turning your back to me for?
Everybody was a little bit tired of peace and love. Everybody got tired of this, and everybody got tired of, yeah, man. Something needed to happen that was a backlash to all that placid, laid back thing, and we hit it with everything. I would like to think that Alice Cooper opened the doors to theatrics. We were sort of the band that drove the stake through the heart of the Love generation. We were just a rock and roll band with a lot of good ideas, It had a little Vegas in it. It had a little Broadway, but it was really rock and roll. The average kid had no idea what to think, because he'd come in, he'd see the show, and he lived in Columbus, Ohio somewhere, and he'd walk out of there going, "What was that?" That was like a truck hit him. I played the part of Alice. I created him, and I don't know where he comes from, to be honest with you. I know that if they say 20 minutes to stage time, everybody leaves, and then I turn into Alice. And then after that, for the next hour and a half, nobody gets near me.
The older that I get, the more that I realize what kind of escapist attraction there is to taking on the role of somebody else. As I've been through that. I loved theatre. I thought it was great, and I thought there was a way of doing something exciting with the stage and rock. The idea of a prefabricated rock star, one that didn't exist, a sampled rock star, I thought was kind of cool. time that I really, I guess, put it all together and really tried to make it work was on the first tour of this character called Ziggy Stardust that I developed. The theatre elements were somewhere between Clockwork Orange and kabuki theatre. Just these, you know, grab this and grab that. A real rag bag of information that didn't actually make any real literal sense. In interviews and stuff, I would just either quote James Dean or Nietzsche. It didn't really matter, because all the ingredients that went into it, people would interpret that, and I'd agree with them.
He represents it all to me. Excitement, space. See, I'm just the space cadet. He's the commander.
I let the whole thing trickle over into my life to such a degree that it affected me dramatically and traumatically for quite a few years during the 70s.
Yes, I had a kind of strange psychosomatic death wish thing. Because I was so lost in Ziggy. It was all that schizophrenia.
How much did Ziggy's death have to do with his own personality or with the circumstances in which he existed, or the...
Yeah, it was his own personality being unable to cope with the circumstances he found himself in, which is being an almighty prophet-like superstar rocker who found he didn't know what to do with it once he got it.
Coming up, the price of fame.
You got friends you thought you'd never have.
And rock goes corporate.
Trying to second guess what the public wants is kind of a fool's game.
On the history of rock and roll.
Anybody can really prepare themselves for fame on the level that we've had. When you try to think about what it'll be like to be famous, you can only comprehend it within the scope of what you've experienced or what you know to be out there. It's so beyond that. There's hot and cold running women, drugs, alcohol, food, limousines, jets, and you very quickly begin to believe that that's the way to live.
We're pampered beyond belief, us, you know, rock and roll superstars. And I still like to get pampered. I'm not being hypocritical, but not to the degrees that, that we prance around and we're very, very spoiled.
I mean, I never tie my own shoelace. I mean, never. It's just not the thing done in rock and roll.
Ironically, you become a rock star because you don't want to do what people tell you to do. It's the classic thing. You want to rebel. You want to have control of your own life. What happens is, if you get extremely famous, you lose that control again because so many people are looking for pieces of you.
And you suddenly, like, you know, you got friends you thought you'd never have, you know.
Hi, fellas! How you doing?
A lot of people show up, and you have to kind of sort out why they've shown up.
Yes, Bobby Quacker.
You know, like sucker fish, those people on the sidelines, lawyers, managers, everybody's starting to call you, hey, babe.
Everybody wants to start advising me what to do, and I get confused, you know.
We couldn't work out how these people had those jobs and how they possibly retained them, because such an awful amount of them seem to be such complete kids.
Artie, Thin Polymer Records, how are you? I'm your promo man here in Chicago. Oh, that's great. I love you guys.
When you're allowed the self-indulgence of being anybody you want to be and having somebody tell you that that's okay, it's very frightening. And in a lot of ways, your art will suffer. I think the 70s was the time when that danger became most apparent, because that's really when everybody started making a lot of money.
Peter Frampton, the Bee Gees, a lot of these bands were selling a lot of albums, big numbers that hadn't been done before.
Frampton Comes Alive was released in January 1976, and it became this ginormous record-breaking record and became the biggest selling record of all time.
The 55,000 that showed up today at Anaheim were there because of only one person, the 26-year-old Englishman whose name is magic enough to have all these rock fans standing out in the hot sun from 1 in the afternoon to 8 o'clock tonight.
The way I think that Frampton Comes Alive changed the industry was that it made everybody realize that there were a lot of people out there, more people than usual, that could buy a record. There's a bigger audience out there than they'd thought, which turned it into a much bigger business almost overnight.
Frampton Comes Alive was the first sort of generally recognized multi-platinum album. And when people realized you could make that much money selling records, they became disinterested in fringe artists. You know, people within the industry became disinterested in fringe artists, started investing everything in these sort of mega platinum artists. And that amount of money also attracted, you know, corporations that had no essential interest in music. You know, they had only interest in money-producing enterprises of any kind. Gulf and Western started buying up record companies, and therefore record companies started being run from accounting offices rather than from A&R offices.
It was a new game, a new, as you would say, a new ball game.
There was the corporate thing in the 70s where people were making, you know, big stadium shows, and the music didn't seem to be quite as good as it should have, or it didn't seem to be being made for quite the right reasons. And you were having certain things that weren't that good just thrust down your throat.
Time to get some records on the radio. We have a shot this week. The album is a smash. There's such a buzz going on. Out of sight. It is a monster.
You know, that was the beginning of that.
I mean, there is this adage in the business that if something works, run it into the ground.
Here are 10 Frampton albums for the jocks.
There are very, very few moves in popular music now which haven't already been plotted out and considered by some major corporation who will put the money behind them. There are not many accidents.
I mean, they got to the point where they was putting things on you to measure your heartbeat to see what songs would work. When you try to do music like that, when you try to put it on an assembly line as a commodity, it changes every time.
Up until that live album came out, I'd always just sat down, you know, wherever I was, wherever I'd gone to write, and written for myself. I knew I had to write an album, but I was basically writing stuff for my own enjoyment. Then Frampton Comes Alive comes along, and I go, oh my God, what do they want now? And all of a sudden, the way I was thinking about writing changed. There was a pressure to write for other people instead of myself.
I mean, the only way artists can do things is to do it for themselves. And trying to second guess what the public wants or likes is kind of a fool's game.
Springsteen rules and drives a stake through the heart of disco on the history of rock and roll.
When it got to the 70s, ourselves, the Earth, Wind and Fire, some of the other Sly and Family Stone, whose influence on all of us, had music where you can dance and it was still rock and roll. You know what I mean? It was dancing. And so we went on into that. And as the funk bands started coming out, they really started dancing. And that became money for the companies. The companies tried to isolate the part of the record that worked, that made it dance. So your first notion is that it's a drum beat. But the mistake is that it's no one drum beat. When they start isolating to one drum beat and one sound, don't nothing get on your nerve more than some rhythmic that's the same thing over and over again. I mean, it's like making love with one stroke. You know, so to tell you to fax that in.
And the machine age sort of took its revenge, I think, on music. And disco music became the antithesis of what music used to be, which was a way to communicate. The music, instead of being an anthem or instead of being a voice, became an accompaniment. It was almost the anthem of alienation. Halls were full of people who were mindlessly dancing to a rhythm that was basically a machine. Most rock and rollers that I knew had a real problem with disco.
I like a lot of disco music, but I detest most of it.
And I hate disco. I really hate it.
I just remember disco and hating it so much.
Our goal in the 70s was to destroy disco. You know, we wanted to see that. We saw that as a terrible menace to music.
Nice, man. Go.
What you need, man? Chopping up the old drum machine, are you?
You know, we have to remember that the most important thing about rock is the attitude. Because, you know, it's not supposed to be really good. Somebody must have kicked you around. Damn the Torpedoes was very important for me because in the writing I found a jumping off place. You know, I found like, okay, well, this is what I do. Because you don't know. You do some of this, you do some of that, and then suddenly, oh, this is what we do. And this is our sound. This isn't the Byrds or anybody else. This is us. You know, the good thing about rock music, in my mind, is that it'll go for a while, and then it'll get very predictable, and then they're just bound to shake it up again, you know? And I love the little times when they shake it up.
Why don't you know that?
In the 70s, I suppose I was aware that there was a connection with the fans, the people that came to see you. There was a greater connection to be made than was being made at the time. When we went to do our show, my idea was that the show should be part circus, part political rally, part spiritual meeting, part dance party. You had to go back to the physical in the end, I always felt, you know. It was like, it sort of began with the physical and you're supposed to end with the physical.
I have seen Bruce, yes. It's a long concert. It was very long. He's excellent, he's very talented, but that was when he obviously didn't have anywhere to go after the show. He just played for about 5, maybe even 6 hours. It was rather long.
How I ended up playing that long, I'm not really sure, you know. it sort of just happened, you know. In the end, the idea was there would be some sort of, you know, physical liberation and you know, sort of, you know, you get their ass moving and the spirit will follow. You know? Also, playing to the point of exhaustion was important to me.
The No Nuke show was a lot of fun. And our slot was immediately before Bruce Springsteen, who was headlining that night. It was his birthday, I think. And people were yelling, Bruce, you know, all night long.
Too bad the guy's name wasn't Melvin or something, huh?
And Jackson Browne, at the side of the stage, he says to me, now listen, if you go on and you think they're booing you, don't get thrown because they're really just saying Bruce. And I said, well, what's the difference?
I think it comes down to the performer and the audience, and that's what it's about in some fashion, you know. And it can be any room. I've had great nights in old clubs in New Jersey where you felt as alive and heightened as in any big place you ever played. When it happens, there's some direct recognition of some sort of mutual humanity, you know, and a good time is had by all, you know.
I think music changed when Bruce Springsteen came on the scene. I think if it wasn't for Bruce Springsteen, we may have gone in a very scary direction. We may have gotten to the point where disco music ruled, and then I would have had to quit.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
The new Chrysler Sebring was built upon something called
Van Halen, Slash, and The Edge.